The incoming U.S. president threatening widespread tariffs on goods imported into the U.S. to tackle unfair trade. Donald Trump suggesting a 10% universal import tariff and up to 60% on Chinese imports. Any change would have an impact on international trade as well as American consumers. Caroline Malone has more from Washington.
Diferentes colores, pero todos son importados de México.
The future cost of trade with the United States is opaque. Wholesale business owner Mr. Flores imports tomatoes from Mexico. He fears any of the tariffs suggested by President-elect Trump will end up hurting consumers.
Cualquier tarifa es un impuesto más que nos afecta a todos. Sí, entonces, incluyendo al que compra una libra, al que compra dos, o al que compra 1,000 o 10,000 libras, todo el tiempo le va a afectar porque lo que nos cobren a nosotros se lo vamos a cobrar al consumidor.
In the last few years, consumer spending has remained strong, despite the economic challenges of inflation and interest rates, leading to a high cost of living, a major factor in Mr. Trump's re-election.
Tariffs will make our country rich.
But won't they raise prices?
Properly used.
The president-elect says tariffs will help, but it's unclear how. Organisations like the National Retail Federation have assessed the potential impact of tariffs. Vice President Jonathan Gold says tariffs can be used as a tool to address trade problems, but need to be strategic and focused.
We found that consumers would lose spending power between $46 to $78 billion. And this is on products, everyday essentials like apparel, footwear, home appliances, toys, travel goods. So, I think, again, as we're looking at tariffs, we want to make sure they're used in a strategic manner.
When Trump was last in charge, the US introduced tariffs on $360 billion worth of goods from China. Beijing fought back with reciprocal tariffs on US goods, leading to a trade war disrupting global supply chains and increasing the cost of business. Later, President Joe Biden further hiked tariffs on semiconductors and electric vehicles. Data estimates show that across the Trump and Biden administrations, these policies decrease US GDP by 0.2% and employment by 142,000 jobs. One stated aim of Trump's new tariff plan is to increase US manufacturing and reduce reliance on others like China. But it may also push US trade partners away.
For all of these countries, the relationship between the US and China is going to be an increasingly difficult one for them to balance, and Trump might make it easier for them to choose China, even while he's putting his finger on the scale to try and do exactly the opposite.
With Trump's return to the White House, it's unclear how many countries could be affected by new tariffs and whether they will introduce retaliatory measures. For President-elect Donald Trump, there is one clear motivation for tariffs, and that is revenue. He has pledged to cut income tax, at the same time to tackle border security, to defend national security and reduce illegal immigration. But with so much uncertainty, it's unclear who will pay the highest price. Caroline Malone, CNA, Washington.
That tariff threat weighing on many minds, the worry that, as we just heard, blanket levies will push up costs for exporters, importers and consumers. Tariffs, in essence, are a levy or a tax on goods which cross borders, in this case on imports into the United States. Under current American law, it's the company that imports the goods that will have to pay that tax to U.S. Customs. Donald Trump has called tax collection the greatest thing ever invented. And it's not always a windfall for government coffers. Slapping on a layer of cost in the form of tariffs must mean costs going up, at least in the short run, since manufacturing supply chains will need time to shift. This could push up consumer prices if exporters and importers are either unwilling or unable to absorb this increase. And the bigger the tariff, the less likely that they might be able to do so. In the long run, however, supply chains could restructure as companies try to cope with these new tariffs by changing where they manufacture, where they source their supplies or sell their goods. While some manufacturing might actually shift onshore to America, as Mr. Trump might want, the U.S. may simply prove too expensive for some companies. So the impact of tariffs on the consumer in the U.S. might be negative. But for manufacturers and exporters around the world, that impact could cut either way. The latest development seeing the incoming president looking to create a new agency. It's called the External Revenue Service. Its job would be to collect tariffs from foreign sources. And Mr. Trump promising that this new department, on the very day he takes office, will take shape. But he did not specify whether the agency would replace the collection of tariffs currently carried out by U.S. customers. And for more on this, we're joined by Vishnu Varathan. He's right here in the studio. He's Managing Director and Chief Economist at Asia and Japan at Mizuho Bank. Thanks for coming, Mr. Vishnu. I think your position is it's unavoidably uncertain, anything about tariffs. But what Mr. Trump has done, this latest development, is to say, by creating this agency the day before he takes office, this agency will necessarily collect from foreign importers to the United States. So does that create any more certainty on who pays for this new tariff?
I mean, at least at the on the face of it, he's creating the optics of the exporter bringing the goods into the U.S. paying for the tariffs. So the process, the cash will go from the exporter to the agency, but who ultimately pays for it, that is still debatable. And it really depends on what actions are taken. So, for example, if the exporter was to price that into the goods that he's selling to the importer, inevitably the importer could end up paying more of it. And then later on, this same importer who then sells it onshore to the US consumer will then have to make a decision on how much of the costs are being passed through. So I think it is safe to say that all parties involved will bear some proportion of the cost. And it comes down to the details, and that depends on what the tariffs are, so on and so forth, and how competitive the particular good is, that will determine which party bears the larger share.
Okay, bear with me now. This sounds simplistic, right? So if the foreign supplier absorbs the cost, which Mr. Trump, by this agency, is intending for it to do, for them to do rather, then it stays the same. Then we're not going to be seeing that regeneration of business, American jobs, American hiring, American import, American manufacturing, which Mr. Trump intended. That's if they absorb. If they do not absorb, they pass that cost on to the consumer. And that's inflation, which Mr. Trump understandably abhors as well. And when we talk about policy, we always talk about win-win. In this instance, is it not distinctly lose-lose?
It is. And that's the case with most tariffs. And that comes down to a question of who loses more and what each party is trying to gain. So in some cases, I think, in some cases, Trump might even argue this goes towards tax collection. And that seems like a very perverse way of getting tax collections. In other cases...
Regressive, not just perverse.
Yeah, it is. And on the other end, he can also say, look, this is to try to get jobs to the U.S., to incentivize manufacturing in the U.S. by, I suppose, in his mind, leveling the playing field, making the cost differentials less. But even that is not a certainty, as you pointed out. It could be that the exporter is so competitive and so efficient in their processes, they can absorb these extra tariffs and still continue to export into the U.S. with no incentive for onshore manufacturers or manufacturing to increase.
The problem with this playing field is that it's not so clear when one loses, the other one necessarily gains. And I'm going to bring up a chart that you actually created from raw data from the IMF, suggesting that maybe China imported less to the United States, but other countries from Asia then made up that import into the United States.
Yes, I mean, that's what we've observed from Trump 1.0, and that's been the evidence so far as well. And what really happens here is, so we can think of it in two ways. One is Chinese exports heading to the US can take a different route, in different ways and forms, and they get into the US via other Asian countries. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but that's what it is. The underlying fundamental here is China's efficiencies, cost efficiencies, are so large that they are unencumbered by these tariffs directed at them. And they're still the best manufacturer in the world, or the most cost-effective one. And that's a compelling proposition all around. And they've got enough margins and buffer to still not be as impacted as maybe other countries might be.
All right. It's easy to accuse Mr. Trump of being unusually keen on tariffs. But in fact, this is not just a US trend. Mr. Biden, while deploring tariffs in his campaign to be president, then went ahead to keep those tariffs, impose more, and effectively ran a comprehensive industrial policy, which was successful in many ways. Mr. Trump is just in keeping with the global trend, where economic security is very much tied to national security. It's not just a threat of tariffs and then retaliation. This is a trend that's here to stay.
It is. I mean, and there's no going back. So whether or not regrettable, we can't go back from this current trend. And one key thing around this is increasingly the world has realized post-globalization that it is not as sexy to just do services. Manufacturing and services go hand in glove and really determine the advantages of a country. So this is here to stay. And really the key issue here is whether or not the tariffs are going to take away so much from global growth that the migration of industries and the evening out comes at a really high cost.
All right, we shall have to see what happens on that one. Thanks so much for coming this evening. Mr. Vishnu Varathan, Managing Director and Chief Economist at Asia ex-Japan at Mizuho Bank.